Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in the crisp morning air of Fort Henderson, her uniform pressed to perfection despite the early hour. The sound of boots marching in rhythm echoed across the parade ground as she watched the new recruits struggle through their first week of basic training. At 28, she had already earned more commendations than most soldiers received in their entire careers, but today felt different. Today, she would meet the man who would unknowingly change the course of her military journey forever. The base was buzzing with unusual activity. Word had spread that Colonel James Harrison, a decorated veteran with 30 years of service, was arriving to take command of the training division. His reputation preceded him like a storm cloud, brilliant tactician, demanding leader, but also known for his old-fashioned views about women in combat roles. Sarah had heard the whispers in the mess hall, the subtle warnings from fellow female officers, but she had faced worse challenges before. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the barracks, Sarah made her way to the administrative building. She had been summoned for what she assumed was a routine briefing about the new command structure. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, each step measured and confident. She had learned long ago that in the military, perception was often as important as performance, and she refused to show even a hint of uncertainty. The secretary's desk sat empty in the outer office, papers scattered as if someone had left in a hurry. Sarah checked her watch. She was precisely on time, as always. Through the frosted glass door, she could hear muffled voices, one significantly louder than the other. She recognized the booming tone immediately from the stories she had heard. Colonel Harrison had arrived early, apparently already making his presence known throughout the base. When the door finally opened, Sarah got her first glimpse of the man who would soon become both her greatest challenge and most unexpected teacher. Colonel Harrison stood well over 6 feet tall, his silver hair cropped in a military cut that hadn't changed since the 1980s. His uniform bore the ribbons and medals of countless campaigns, each one representing a story of courage, sacrifice, or strategic brilliance. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention, sharp, calculating, and currently filled with what appeared to be mild annoyance. Behind him stood Major William Chen, the outgoing training coordinator, looking relieved to be passing his responsibilities to someone else. The training division had been struggling with budget cuts and personnel shortages, challenges that would require both innovation and leadership to overcome. Sarah had been working on several proposals to address these issues, ideas that she hoped would demonstrate her value to the new command structure. Colonel Harrison, Major Chen began, his voice carrying a note of nervous energy, "I'd like you to meet one of our most capable officers. This is Captain Mitchell. She's been instrumental in developing our new training protocols." Sarah stepped forward, her salute crisp and professional. "Sir, Captain Sarah Mitchell reporting. Welcome to Fort Henderson." She maintained eye contact, a habit that had served her well throughout her career. In the military, respect was earned through competence and confidence, and she had plenty of both. Colonel Harrison's response was not what she had expected. Instead of returning her salute or acknowledging her greeting, he glanced at her briefly before turning his attention back to Major Chen. It was as if she had become invisible, her presence no more significant than the furniture in the room. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt a familiar fire begin to burn in her chest. "Chen," the colonel said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command, "I want a complete briefing on all personnel assignments. I need to understand who's responsible for what around here." He moved to the large desk that would now be his, spreading out files and documents with the efficiency of someone accustomed to taking control quickly. Major Chen shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the awkward dynamic developing in the room. "Sir, Captain Mitchell has been leading the development of our new simulation training program. Her work has increased recruit performance scores by 23% over the past 6 months." Sarah appreciated Chen's attempt to include her in the conversation, but she could see that Colonel Harrison was only half listening. His attention seemed focused on the paperwork before him, occasionally glancing up when Chen mentioned budget figures or personnel numbers. It was clear that he had already formed opinions about the base and its operations, opinions that apparently didn't include much consideration for her contributions. The meeting continued for another hour, with Sarah standing at attention while the two men discussed training schedules, resource allocation, and strategic priorities. She found herself studying Colonel Harrison's mannerisms, the way he processed information and made decisions. Despite her growing frustration with his apparent dismissal of her presence, she had to admit that his military knowledge was impressive. His questions were sharp and insightful, revealing a deep understanding of both tactical training and military bureaucracy. As the briefing drew to a close, Major Chen made one final attempt to highlight Sarah's role in the training program. "Colonel, I should mention that Captain Mitchell will be your primary liaison for the new urban warfare simulation project. She's been working directly with the Pentagon on implementation." For the first time since the meeting began, Colonel Harrison looked directly at Sarah. His expression was neutral, but she caught something in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. It wasn't hostility exactly, but rather a kind of patient condescension that she had encountered before in her career. It was the look of someone who had already decided that she was probably competent enough for routine tasks but shouldn't be trusted with anything truly important. "I see," he said simply, his tone giving nothing away. "We'll discuss project assignments after I've had time to review all current operations." The dismissal was polite but final, and Sarah understood that her role in the upcoming changes was far from certain. After Major Chen left to attend to other duties, Sarah found herself alone with Colonel Harrison for the first time. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken tensions and expectations. She debated whether to speak up about her projects and qualifications, or simply wait to be dismissed. Her military training told her to wait for orders, but her instincts as a leader urged her to take initiative. "Sir," she began carefully, "if you have any questions about the current training programs or my recommendations for improvements, I'm available to provide detailed briefings at your convenience." Colonel Harrison looked up from his papers, and, for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something that might have been respect. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same neutral expression he had worn throughout the meeting. "Captain," he replied, his voice measured and professional, "I appreciate your enthusiasm. However, I prefer to form my own assessments before making any significant changes. I'm sure you understand." The words were reasonable, even diplomatic, but Sarah heard the underlying message clearly. He would be starting fresh, evaluating everything and everyone according to his own standards. Her previous achievements and current projects were merely data points to be considered, not accomplishments to be respected. It was a position she had found herself in before, but somehow this felt different. More personal. As she left the administrative building and walked back across the parade ground, Sarah reflected on the encounter. She had faced skeptical commanders before, officers who questioned whether women belonged in combat roles or leadership positions. But Colonel Harrison's dismissal felt more subtle and, perhaps, more dangerous. He hadn't openly challenged her competence or made any inappropriate comments. Instead, he had simply acted as if her opinions and contributions were of minimal importance. The afternoon sun beat down on the training grounds where recruits were running obstacle courses and practicing marksmanship. Sarah watched them struggle and succeed, remembering her own early days in the military when every day felt like a test she had to pass. She had learned to excel not just to advance her career, but to prove that women could perform at the same level as their male counterparts. Now, facing a new commander who seemed to embody old-fashioned attitudes about military hierarchy, she wondered if she would have to fight those battles all over again. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the files for her current projects. The urban warfare simulation program represented months of research and development, incorporating lessons learned from recent conflicts and cutting-edge technology. The Pentagon had specifically requested her involvement based on her background in both combat operations and training development. Yet Colonel Harrison had dismissed it as if it were a routine administrative matter. She opened her laptop and began drafting a comprehensive briefing document that would outline not just her current projects, but her qualifications and achievements over the past 5 years. If Colonel Harrison wanted to form his own assessment, she would make sure he had all the information he needed to make an informed decision. She had learned that in the military, as in life, you couldn't always control how others perceived you, but you could control how well you presented yourself. As she worked late into the night, Sarah found herself thinking about the challenges that lay ahead. She had built her career on merit and hard work, earning respect through performance rather than politics. But she was beginning to realize that with Colonel Harrison, she might need to employ different strategies. He was clearly a formidable opponent, someone who had survived and thrived in the military hierarchy for 3 decades. Underestimating him would be a mistake, but allowing him to underestimate her might be an even bigger one. The base grew quiet around her, the sounds of military life fading into the peaceful rhythm of night duty. But Sarah continued working, driven by a determination that had carried her through every challenge of her military career. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove herself, and she intended to be ready for whatever Colonel Harrison threw at her. She had no way of knowing that their next encounter would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything both of them believed about leadership, respect, and the true meaning of military service. 3 weeks had passed since Colonel Harrison's arrival, and the changes at Fort Henderson were becoming increasingly apparent. New protocols had been implemented, training schedules restructured, and several long-standing programs had been put under review. Sarah found herself walking a careful line between adapting to the new leadership style and maintaining the progress she had worked so hard to achieve. The morning briefing room was filled with the usual collection of officers, each carrying folders and tablets loaded with reports and recommendations. Sarah had prepared extensively for this meeting, knowing that it would be her first real opportunity to present her urban warfare simulation project directly to Colonel Harrison. She had spent the previous evening rehearsing her presentation, anticipating questions and preparing detailed answers about implementation timelines and budget requirements. As officers filed into the conference room, Sarah noticed the subtle changes in atmosphere that Colonel Harrison had brought to the base. Conversations were more formal, postures more rigid, and there was an underlying tension that hadn't existed under the previous command. Some of the younger officers seemed energized by the increased discipline, while others appeared uncomfortable with the stricter oversight. Colonel Harrison entered the room with his characteristic purposeful stride, carrying a leather portfolio that Sarah had learned contained detailed notes about every aspect of base operations. He had a remarkable memory for statistics and procedures, often citing specific regulation numbers or budget line items without referring to his notes. It was an impressive display of military knowledge, though Sarah sometimes wondered if his focus on details might cause him to miss broader strategic considerations. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Today we'll be reviewing the status of all current training initiatives and discussing resource allocation for the upcoming quarter." He opened his portfolio and consulted a handwritten list, his eyes scanning the room as he identified the officers responsible for each agenda item. The first hour of the meeting focused on routine operational matters, maintenance schedules, personnel rotations, and budget reviews. Sarah listened carefully, noting how Colonel Harrison approached decision-making and which factors seemed to influence his priorities. She began to understand that he valued efficiency and measurable results above innovation or creative approaches. It was information she would need to incorporate into her presentation strategy. When her turn finally arrived, Sarah stood and activated the projection screen, displaying the first slide of her carefully prepared presentation. The urban warfare simulation project had been her primary focus for months, representing a significant advancement in training methodology that could potentially be adopted throughout the military. "Sir, I'd like to present the current status and implementation plan for the urban warfare simulation training program," she began, her voice steady and professional. "This initiative has been developed in coordination with Pentagon training specialists and incorporates lessons learned from recent deployment experiences." She launched into her presentation, explaining the technical specifications of the simulation equipment, the training scenarios that had been developed, and the measurable improvements in recruit performance that had already been documented. The data was compelling. Soldiers who completed the simulation training showed significantly better decision-making skills in complex urban environments, reduced friendly fire incidents, and improved coordination with civilian populations. As she spoke, Sarah watched Colonel Harrison's face for any sign of his reaction to the information. His expression remained neutral, occasionally making notes in his portfolio, but giving no indication of whether he was impressed or skeptical of her work. The other officers in the room seemed engaged with the presentation, asking thoughtful questions about implementation details and potential applications to other training programs. When she reached the section about budget requirements and timeline projections, Sarah noticed Colonel Harrison's attention sharpen. These were clearly the details that mattered most to him, the practical considerations that would determine whether her project moved forward or joined the growing list of initiatives under review. The total implementation cost for the full system would be approximately $2.3 million over 18 months, she explained, displaying a detailed breakdown of equipment costs, software licensing fees, and personnel training requirements. However, the Pentagon has indicated that successful implementation at Fort Henderson could lead to adoption at 12 additional training facilities, potentially saving millions in traditional training costs. For the first time during her presentation, Colonel Harrison interrupted with a question. Captain Mitchell, have you conducted any cost-benefit analysis comparing this simulation system to our current training methods? The question was reasonable and expected, one that Sarah had prepared for extensively. Yes, sir, I have. She clicked to the next slide, which displayed a comprehensive comparison of training costs, time requirements, and measurable outcomes between traditional and simulation-based training approaches. Our analysis indicates that simulation training reduces overall training time by approximately 30% while improving performance metrics by an average of 23%, she continued. Additionally, simulation training eliminates the safety risks and environmental impact associated with live-fire urban training exercises. As she presented the comparative data, Sarah felt increasingly confident about her material and delivery. The numbers were solid, the methodology was sound, and the potential benefits were significant. She had anticipated most of the technical questions and was prepared with detailed answers. What she hadn't anticipated was Colonel Harrison's response to her conclusions. When she finished the formal presentation and asked for questions, Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Sarah could feel the attention of everyone in the room focused on the interaction between herself and the commanding officer. Captain, he said finally, his tone carrying a note that Sarah couldn't quite identify, this is certainly an ambitious project. However, I have some concerns about the underlying assumptions in your analysis. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she maintained her professional composure. I'd be happy to address any specific concerns you might have, sir. Colonel Harrison stood and walked to the projection screen, pointing to the performance improvement statistics. These numbers suggest that simulation training is categorically superior to traditional methods. In my experience, such dramatic improvements are rarely achieved through technological solutions alone. The comment was delivered in a measured tone, but Sarah detected an underlying skepticism that went beyond healthy questioning of her methodology. She sensed that this was about more than just budget concerns or implementation challenges. Sir, the performance improvements are based on standardized testing protocols developed by the Pentagon's Training Assessment Division, she replied carefully. The methodology has been validated through multiple pilot programs at different installations. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, but his expression suggested that he remained unconvinced. I understand that, Captain. But I've seen many promising training innovations over the years that failed to deliver their projected benefits when implemented at scale. The criticism stung, partly because it dismissed months of careful research and development, but also because it seemed to question her professional judgment. Sarah had encountered similar skepticism before, usually from officers who were resistant to change or uncomfortable with technological advancement. But Colonel Harrison's challenge felt more personal, as if he was questioning not just her project but her competence as an officer. With respect, sir, she said, working to keep any defensiveness out of her voice, the simulation technology has already been successfully implemented at Fort Bragg and Fort Campbell with documented positive results. We're not dealing with untested experimental systems. What happened next would remain burned in Sarah's memory for years to come. Colonel Harrison looked at her for a moment, then turned to address the other officers in the room, and he laughed. It wasn't a cruel or malicious laugh, but rather the kind of indulgent chuckle that adults sometimes gave to children who had shared an amusing but naive observation. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying a tone of patient amusement, I think we can all appreciate Captain Mitchell's enthusiasm for new technology. However, we need to remember that there's no substitute for real-world training and experience. These simulation games might be impressive to watch, but they don't prepare soldiers for the actual chaos and uncertainty of combat. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Simulation games. The dismissive phrase reduced months of serious military research to something trivial and recreational. But it was the laugh that truly stung, the sound of someone who found her professional presentation amusing rather than worthy of serious consideration. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet, with several officers looking between Sarah and Colonel Harrison as if witnessing an accident they couldn't prevent. Major Rodriguez, who had worked closely with Sarah on technical specifications, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, who had been supportive of the project from the beginning, stared at his hands rather than make eye contact with anyone. Sarah felt her face flush, but she forced herself to remain standing and maintain her professional bearing. Years of military training had taught her to control her emotional responses, especially in situations where showing weakness could be damaging to her career. But, inside, she was fighting a battle between anger, humiliation, and disbelief. "Sir," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I believe the data clearly demonstrates the effectiveness of simulation-based training supplements. The Pentagon's endorsement of this approach is based on extensive field testing and measurable results." Colonel Harrison's expression softened slightly, as if he had just realized that his response might have been harsher than intended. But the damage had been done, and everyone in the room understood the dynamics that had just been established. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his tone becoming more formal and diplomatic, "I appreciate the work you've put into this analysis. However, given our current budget constraints and competing priorities, I think we need to focus our resources on proven training methods rather than experimental programs." The dismissal was final and absolute. Months of work, collaboration with Pentagon specialists, and documented success at other installations had been reduced to experimental programs unworthy of consideration. Sarah understood that this wasn't really about budget constraints or competing priorities. This was about Colonel Harrison's perception of her judgment and capabilities. As the meeting moved on to other agenda items, Sarah remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, processing what had just happened. She had been thoroughly and publicly dismissed by her commanding officer, her professional competence questioned in front of her peers. More significantly, she had been laughed at, treated as if her contributions were more amusing than valuable. When she finally sat down, Sarah forced herself to pay attention to the remainder of the meeting, taking notes and participating in discussions as if nothing significant had occurred. But her mind was racing, analyzing not just what had happened but what it meant for her future at Fort Henderson under Colonel Harrison's command. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out of the conference room, several colleagues approached her with sympathetic looks and quiet words of support. But their consolation only reinforced the reality of what had occurred. She had been humiliated in front of her peers, and everyone knew it. That afternoon, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the base, trying to process her emotions and develop a strategy for moving forward. The urban warfare simulation project had been more than just a professional assignment for her, it had been an opportunity to make a significant contribution to military training and potentially advance her career. Now it was effectively dead, killed not by legitimate concerns about its effectiveness but by her commanding officer's preconceived notions about its value. As she walked, Sarah reflected on the strange dynamics that had emerged since Colonel Harrison's arrival. She had initially attributed his apparent dismissal of her contributions to the natural adjustment period that comes with new leadership. But today's meeting had revealed something deeper and more troubling. He didn't just disagree with her recommendations, he found them amusing. The thought that bothered her most wasn't the professional setback, significant though it was. It was the realization that Colonel Harrison had already formed conclusions about her capabilities and judgment, conclusions that seemed immune to evidence or argument. The laugh had revealed his true opinion more clearly than any formal evaluation could have done. That evening, as she sat in her quarters preparing for the next day's duties, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be more significant than she could have imagined. She would not allow Colonel Harrison's dismissive attitude to derail her career or discourage her from pursuing innovative solutions to training challenges. If he wanted to underestimate her capabilities, she would use that to her advantage. But what Sarah didn't know, as she planned her next moves in what she assumed was a straightforward clash of military personalities, was that Colonel Harrison was harboring a secret that would change everything. His dismissive attitude toward her wasn't based on gender bias or resistance to change, as she had assumed. It was rooted in something far more complex and personal, something that would soon force both of them to confront the true nature of authority, respect, and leadership in the modern military. The weeks following the disastrous briefing had settled into an uncomfortable routine at Fort Henderson. Sarah continued her duties with the same professionalism she had always maintained, but there was a noticeable shift in how she was treated by Colonel Harrison's administration. Her input was rarely sought during planning sessions, her project recommendations were consistently shelved for further review, and she found herself assigned to increasingly routine administrative tasks. Despite the professional setbacks, Sarah had begun to notice something unexpected about Colonel Harrison's leadership style. While he had dismissed her simulation project, his other decisions demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of military training and personnel management. He had quietly resolved several long-standing personnel conflicts, implemented efficiency improvements that saved both time and money, and earned the respect of many junior officers through his fair treatment of disciplinary matters. The contradiction puzzled Sarah. The man who had laughed at her presentation clearly possessed exceptional military judgment in other areas. She began to wonder if there was more to his dismissive attitude than simple bias or resistance to change. But every attempt to engage him in substantive discussion about training improvements was met with polite but firm redirection to routine matters. The morning of October 15th began like any other, with reveille sounding across the base and soldiers moving through their established routines. Sarah was reviewing maintenance reports in her office when her assistant, Sergeant Martinez, knocked on her door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Ma'am, you need to see this," Martinez said, holding a manila envelope marked with official Pentagon seals. "It just arrived by special courier." Sarah accepted the envelope with curiosity, noting the formal military postal markings and priority delivery stamps. Official communications from the Pentagon were not uncommon, but they rarely arrived with such urgency unless something significant was happening. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolding a single page of official letterhead. As she read the document, Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. The letter was signed by General Patricia Morrison, Chief of Staff for Military Personnel, and it contained information that would change everything she thought she knew about her situation at Fort Henderson. The communication was brief and direct, as military correspondence typically was, but its implications were staggering. General Morrison was informing Colonel Harrison that his request for extended duty assignment had been approved, and that his transition to civilian contractor status would be delayed pending completion of a special assignment that required his specific expertise. But it was the next paragraph that made Sarah's hands tremble slightly as she held the letter. General Morrison wrote, "As discussed in our previous correspondence, this arrangement will allow you to complete your evaluation of Captain Sarah Mitchell's qualifications for promotion to Major and potential assignment to the Pentagon's Advanced Training Development Division. Your assessment will be crucial in determining whether Captain Mitchell is prepared for the increased responsibilities and security clearance requirements of her proposed new position." Sarah read the paragraph 3 times, struggling to process its implications. Colonel Harrison hadn't been evaluating her performance as a routine matter of command responsibility. He had been conducting a specific assessment of her qualifications for a promotion and assignment that she hadn't even known was under consideration. The simulation project, her briefings, even their daily interactions had all been part of a formal evaluation process. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying. A promotion to major and assignment to the Pentagon would represent a significant advancement in her career, an opportunity to influence military training policy at the highest levels. But it also meant that every encounter with Colonel Harrison had been a test, and, based on his apparent dismissal of her capabilities, she might have already failed. Sergeant Martinez had been watching her face as she read, and now cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. "Martinez, this communication was delivered to me by mistake. It should have gone directly to Colonel Harrison. Please ensure that it reaches him immediately, and don't mention to anyone that you saw it first." As Martinez left to deliver the misrouted letter, Sarah sat back in her chair and tried to make sense of this new information. If Colonel Harrison was evaluating her for a Pentagon assignment, why had he been so dismissive of her work? Why had he laughed at her presentation if he was supposed to be assessing her qualifications for advanced responsibility? The answer that began to emerge was both obvious and unsettling. Colonel Harrison might have been testing not just her technical competence, but her resilience, leadership potential, and ability to handle setbacks and criticism. Military leadership required the ability to persevere in the face of skepticism and opposition. Perhaps his dismissive attitude had been calculated to see how she would respond to professional adversity. But, even as this explanation formed in her mind, Sarah felt a growing anger about the deception involved. If she was being evaluated for promotion, she had a right to know. The secretive nature of the assessment felt manipulative and unfair, especially given the personal and professional stress it had caused her. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself analyzing every interaction with Colonel Harrison through this new lens. His questions during briefings, his assignment of routine tasks, even his body language during meetings took on new significance as potential elements of an ongoing evaluation. The realization was both empowering and exhausting, as she second-guessed every response and decision. The situation became even more complicated when she began to notice subtle changes in Colonel Harrison's behavior following the delivery of the misrouted letter. His interactions with her became slightly more formal, as if he suspected that she might have learned something about the true nature of their professional relationship. During staff meetings, she caught him watching her responses to various situations with what appeared to be analytical interest rather than routine supervisory attention. The breaking point came during a crisis response exercise that Colonel Harrison had organized to test the base's readiness for emergency situations. The scenario involved a simulated terrorist attack on the main facility, requiring rapid coordination between multiple units and careful management of civilian personnel. Sarah found herself assigned to coordinate communications between the command center and field units, a responsibility that would normally fall to a more senior officer. As the exercise began, it became clear that the communications systems were experiencing significant technical difficulties. Radio transmissions were intermittent, computer networks were slow to respond, and several critical information links had failed completely. The situation was chaotic and potentially dangerous, as field units were operating without reliable contact with command authority. Sarah quickly recognized that the technical failures were likely intentional elements of the exercise, designed to test leadership and problem-solving abilities under pressure. But, regardless of whether the problems were real or simulated, the solutions required were very real. She began implementing emergency communication protocols, establishing backup systems, and coordinating alternative methods of maintaining contact with field units. As she worked to restore reliable communications, Sarah became aware that Colonel Harrison was observing her efforts with intense attention. He stood at the back of the command center, making notes in his ever-present portfolio, but his focus was clearly on her performance rather than the overall exercise. The realization that this was likely another test made her both more determined to succeed and more frustrated with the ongoing deception. When one of the backup communication systems failed, creating a potential gap in coverage for a critical field unit, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be pivotal. Instead of following standard protocol and requesting permission to implement an untested solution, she took immediate action to establish an alternative communication link using equipment from her abandoned simulation project. The urban warfare simulation system included sophisticated communication capabilities that could be quickly reconfigured for emergency use. Sarah directed her technical team to modify the simulation equipment, creating a backup communication network that successfully restored contact with the isolated field unit. The solution was innovative, effective, and demonstrated exactly the kind of creative problem-solving that military leadership required. As the exercise concluded and normal operations resumed, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and apprehension about her performance. She had successfully managed a complex technical crisis and demonstrated the value of the simulation technology that Colonel Harrison had dismissed weeks earlier. But she had also violated protocol by implementing unauthorized solutions without prior approval. The after-action briefing took place in the main conference room, with all participating officers present to discuss lessons learned and areas for improvement. Colonel Harrison conducted the session with his typical thoroughness, examining each aspect of the exercise and identifying both successful responses and opportunities for enhancement. When the discussion reached Sarah's communications management, Colonel Harrison's analysis was detailed and surprisingly positive. He praised her quick thinking, effective coordination, and successful resolution of multiple technical failures. But he also noted her deviation from standard protocol and questioned the appropriateness of using unauthorized equipment during an emergency exercise. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes revealing something that might have been approval, "your technical solutions were effective, but they raised concerns about adherence to established procedures. How do you justify implementing untested systems without proper authorization?" The question was clearly another test, and Sarah understood that her answer would be carefully evaluated. She had learned enough about Colonel Harrison's leadership philosophy to know that he valued both innovation and discipline, but she wasn't sure which quality he considered more important in this situation. "Sir," she replied carefully, "emergency situations sometimes require leaders to choose between following established procedures and achieving mission objectives. In this case, the failure of standard communication systems created a potential safety risk for field personnel. I believe that the immediate implementation of an alternative solution was more important than adherence to authorization protocols." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, making additional notes in his portfolio. "And if your unauthorized solution had failed and created additional complications? Then, I would have been fully responsible for those consequences," Sarah answered without hesitation. Leadership requires accepting responsibility for both successful and unsuccessful decisions, especially when those decisions involve risk. For the first time since the misrouted letter had revealed the true nature of their relationship, Colonel Harrison smiled. It wasn't the dismissive laugh that had humiliated her weeks earlier, but rather an expression of what appeared to be genuine satisfaction with her response. "Very good, Captain," he said. "That's exactly the kind of judgment we need from military leaders." As the briefing concluded and officers began to disperse, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions about what had just occurred. The exercise had clearly been designed to test her decision-making abilities under pressure, and she believed she had performed well. But the ongoing deception about the evaluation process continued to frustrate her, especially now that she was more certain than ever that Colonel Harrison knew she had learned about the Pentagon assignment. That evening, as she sat in her quarters reviewing the day's events, Sarah made a decision that would force both her and Colonel Harrison to confront the unspoken tensions that had been building between them. She would request a private meeting to discuss her career prospects and address directly the issues that had been hanging over their professional relationship. But what Sarah didn't realize was that Colonel Harrison had been wrestling with his own ethical concerns about the evaluation process. The Pentagon had asked him to assess her qualifications without revealing the nature of the evaluation, a request that had become increasingly problematic as he grew to respect her abilities and recognize the unfairness of the situation. He too had been planning a conversation that would address the deception and secrecy that had complicated their professional relationship. The stage was set for a confrontation that would finally reveal the truth about the Pentagon assignment, Colonel Harrison's true assessment of Sarah's capabilities, and the reason behind his apparent dismissiveness toward her work. But neither of them could have anticipated that this conversation would also uncover a secret about Colonel Harrison himself, one that would completely change Sarah's understanding of military hierarchy, authority, and the complex relationships that existed within the chain of command. The request for a private meeting had been submitted through proper channels, but Sarah's hands still trembled slightly as she knocked on Colonel Harrison's office door. 3 days had passed since her decision to confront the situation directly, 3 days of careful preparation and mental rehearsal for what might be the most important conversation of her military career. "Enter," came the familiar voice from within, and Sarah stepped into the office that had become the center of so much professional uncertainty. Colonel Harrison was seated behind his desk, but he gestured toward the small conference table in the corner of the room, suggesting a more informal setting for their discussion. As they settled into chairs across from each other, Sarah noticed that Colonel Harrison seemed different somehow. The confident authority that had characterized all their previous interactions was still present, but it was tempered by what appeared to be genuine concern, perhaps even regret. His portfolio lay closed on the table, and, for the first time since she had known him, he didn't seem to be consulting notes or reviewing official documents. "Captain Mitchell," he began, his tone more personal than she had ever heard from him, "I believe we have several matters to discuss. Before we begin, I want you to know that this conversation is completely off the record, and you should feel free to speak candidly about any concerns you might have." The invitation to speak candidly was both encouraging and intimidating. Sarah had prepared for this meeting by organizing her thoughts around specific issues: the Pentagon assignment, the evaluation process, and her treatment since his arrival. But, now, facing him in this more relaxed setting, she found herself uncertain about where to begin. "Sir," she said, choosing her words carefully, "I become aware that there may be aspects of my current assignment that I don't fully understand. Specifically, I have reason to believe that my performance is being evaluated for purposes beyond routine command assessment." Colonel Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught a subtle shift in his posture that suggested her words had hit their target. He was quiet for a long moment, seemingly weighing his response carefully before speaking. "Captain, before we discuss your situation, I need to share something with you that will put our entire relationship in a different context." He paused, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before: vulnerability, perhaps even fear. "What I'm about to tell you is classified information that has been compartmentalized at the highest levels of military command. It will explain my behavior over the past few months, but it will also place you in a position where you'll need to make some difficult decisions about your career and your obligations to the military." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Colonel Harrison reached into his desk and withdrew a manila folder marked with security classifications she had never seen before. The designation "Eyes Only," a special compartmented information, was stamped across the cover in red ink, and she could see additional markings that indicated the involvement of multiple intelligence agencies. 6 months ago, Colonel Harrison continued, I was approached by a joint task force representing the Pentagon, CIA, and NSA. They had identified a potential security breach in military training programs, specifically related to the unauthorized transfer of classified training methodologies to foreign military organizations. As he spoke, Sarah began to understand that whatever was contained in that folder would change everything she thought she knew about her situation at Fort Henderson. The serious expression on Colonel Harrison's face made it clear that this was not routine military business, but rather something that could have significant implications for national security. The investigation indicated that someone with access to advanced training programs was providing detailed information about American military capabilities to representatives of hostile foreign governments. The information being transferred included technical specifications for simulation systems, tactical training protocols, and assessment methodologies that could be used to neutralize American military advantages. Sarah felt a chill run through her as the implications of Colonel Harrison's words became clear. Sir, are you saying that my simulation project is somehow connected to the security investigation? I'm saying, Colonel Harrison replied carefully, that your simulation project was specifically mentioned in intercepted communications between suspected foreign agents and their handlers. Your work had attracted the attention of people who had no legitimate reason to be interested in American training methods. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her months of dedicated work on improving military training had somehow become entangled in a counterintelligence investigation. The project that she had been so proud of, the innovation that she had hoped would advance her career, was now under suspicion as a potential source of security leaks. The task force asked me to accept the assignment at Fort Henderson specifically to conduct a covert assessment of your project and your potential involvement in the security breach, Colonel Harrison continued. My orders were to evaluate not just your technical work, but your loyalty, your judgment, and your potential vulnerability to foreign intelligence operations. Sarah struggled to process this information, her mind racing through the implications of what she was learning. Every dismissive comment, every routine assignment, every apparent slight had been part of an elaborate counterintelligence operation designed to test her responses and evaluate her trustworthiness. That's why you dismissed my presentation, she said, understanding beginning to dawn. You were testing to see how I would react to professional setbacks, whether I might become disgruntled enough to be vulnerable to foreign recruitment. Colonel Harrison nodded gravely. The task force believed that someone involved in the training program development was either being deliberately used by foreign agents or was unknowingly providing access to classified information. Your project was at the center of their investigation, which meant you were automatically a person of interest. The weight of this revelation was almost overwhelming. 4 months, Sarah had been under investigation as a potential security threat, subjected to covert assessment by her own commanding officer. The professional challenges that had caused her so much stress and self-doubt had been carefully orchestrated tests of her loyalty and resilience. But there's more, Colonel Harrison said, his voice taking on a tone that Sarah had never heard before. something that sounded almost like respect mixed with apprehension. 3 weeks ago, our investigation reached a conclusion that changes everything. He opened the classified folder and withdrew a single page marked with official seals and signatures. As he handed it to Sarah, she could see that her hands were shaking as she accepted the document. The letter had indicated that it came from the highest levels of military intelligence, and the content would prove to be more shocking than anything she could have imagined. The document was brief, but its implications were staggering. After months of investigation, the task force had identified the actual source of the security leaks. The individual who had been providing classified training information to foreign agents was Major William Chen, the officer who had been responsible for training coordination before Colonel Harrison's arrival. But it was the final paragraph of the report that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The investigation had also revealed that Major Chen had deliberately attempted to implicate Sarah in the security breaches by manipulating documentation to make it appear that she had been the source of leaked information. His plan had been to use her as a scapegoat while continuing his own espionage activities under a new commanding officer who would be focused on investigating her rather than him. Major Chen has been arrested and is currently being held in a military detention facility pending court-martial proceedings, Colonel Harrison explained. The evidence against him is overwhelming, including recorded communications with foreign agents and financial records showing significant unexplained payments to accounts under his control. Sarah looked up from the document, still struggling to comprehend the full scope of what she had learned. "Sir, this means that I was never really under suspicion. Major Chen was trying to frame me for his own crimes." "That's correct," Colonel Harrison replied. "And it also means that my assessment of your character, judgment, and loyalty has been overwhelmingly positive. Despite being subjected to professional skepticism, unfair treatment, and deliberate provocation, you maintained your integrity and continued to perform at the highest levels." The emotional impact of this revelation was complex and powerful. Relief at learning that she wasn't suspected of treason mixed with anger at having been subjected to months of deceptive treatment. Pride in having passed what amounted to an extreme test of character battled with frustration at not having been trusted with the truth from the beginning. "There's one more thing," Colonel Harrison said, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. "The Pentagon assignment that you learned about through the misrouted letter is real, and it's been approved based on my assessment of your qualifications." He reached into his desk and withdrew another official document, this one bearing the seal of the Secretary of Defense. As he handed it to Sarah, she could see that his expression had changed again, this time showing something that looked unmistakably like pride. "Captain Sarah Mitchell," he said formally, "it is my honor to inform you that you have been selected for immediate promotion to the rank of Major and assignment to the Pentagon's Advanced Training Development Division. Your new position will involve developing next-generation training systems for all branches of the military, with a security clearance that will give you access to some of our most sensitive strategic information." Sarah stared at the promotion orders, her mind reeling from the rapid succession of revelations. In the span of a single conversation, she had learned that she had been under covert investigation, that a colleague had attempted to frame her for treason, and that she was being promoted to one of the most prestigious assignments available to someone of her rank. But it was what Colonel Harrison said next that would prove to be the most shocking revelation of all. "Major Mitchell," he said, using her new rank for the first time, "there's something else you need to know about your new assignment. The Advanced Training Development Division is currently under the command of Brigadier General Patricia Morrison, who has been overseeing this entire investigation." Sarah nodded, recognizing the name from the letter she had seen, but not understanding why Colonel Harrison seemed to think this information was particularly significant. "General Morrison," Colonel Harrison continued, "is also my daughter." The words hung in the air between them as Sarah struggled to process this final piece of the puzzle. Colonel Harrison's daughter was a brigadier general, outranking him significantly, and she had been overseeing an investigation that had placed her father in the position of evaluating Sarah's qualifications and character. "Sir," Sarah said slowly, "are you saying that you've been taking orders from your own daughter?" Colonel Harrison smiled, and, for the first time since she had known him, the expression was completely genuine and unguarded. "Major Mitchell, in the military, rank supersedes all other relationships. When Brigadier General Morrison gives me an order, I follow it, regardless of our family connection. That's what military discipline means." The irony was both profound and humbling. Sarah had spent months believing that Colonel Harrison was an old-fashioned officer who underestimated her capabilities because of his traditional views about women in the military. In reality, he had been taking orders from a woman who outranked him, following the instructions of a daughter who had risen through the military hierarchy to a position of significant authority. As they sat in the quiet of Colonel Harrison's office, both of them processing the implications of everything that had been revealed, Sarah began to understand the true complexity of military service. Leadership, authority, respect, and loyalty were not simple concepts that could be easily categorized or understood. They were nuanced, complicated, and sometimes contradictory forces that required constant judgment and careful balance. "Major Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said finally, "I owe you an apology for the deception that was necessary during this investigation. You handled yourself with exceptional professionalism despite circumstances that were designed to be challenging and unfair." Sarah considered his words carefully before responding. "Sir, I understand that you were following orders and conducting a necessary investigation. But I hope that in the future, there might be ways to evaluate officer performance that don't require quite so much subterfuge." Colonel Harrison laughed, and this time the sound was warm and genuine rather than dismissive. "Major, something tells me that in your new position at the Pentagon, you'll have plenty of opportunities to influence how these things are handled in the future." As Sarah prepared to leave Fort Henderson and begin her new assignment, she reflected on the lessons she had learned during her months under Colonel Harrison's command. She had discovered that first impressions could be misleading, that authority came in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest tests of character occurred when you didn't even know you were being tested. Most importantly, she had learned that in the military, as in life, respect was something that had to be earned through performance, integrity, and resilience. Colonel Harrison had laughed at her presentation not because he thought her work was amusing, but because he was testing her ability to persevere in the face of skepticism and doubt. She had passed that test, and many others, earning not just a promotion but the respect of an officer whose opinion she had come to value deeply. Years later, when Major Mitchell had become Colonel Mitchell and was facing her own challenges in evaluating junior officers, she would remember the lessons she had learned from Colonel Harrison. She would understand that sometimes the most effective leadership required difficult decisions, uncomfortable deceptions, and the willingness to be misunderstood in service of larger objectives. But she would also remember the importance of treating people with dignity and respect, even when conducting necessary evaluations of their character and capabilities. The methods that had been used to test her, while effective, had also been unnecessarily harsh and demoralizing. In her future leadership roles, she would work to find ways to assess and develop subordinates that honored both military necessity and human dignity. The day she left Fort Henderson, Colonel Harrison was there to see her off, along with many of the officers who had witnessed their complex professional relationship over the preceding months. As they shook hands for the final time, he offered one last piece of advice that would guide her throughout her subsequent military career. "Major Mitchell," he said, "remember that true military leadership is not about commanding others to respect you. It's about earning that respect through your actions, your decisions, and your treatment of the people under your command. The best officers are those who understand that authority is not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be carried with honor." Sarah carried those words with her as she began her new assignment, working alongside Brigadier General Morrison and other senior officers to develop the next generation of military training systems. Her simulation project, which had been dismissed and nearly cancelled, became the foundation for a revolutionary advancement in military preparation that was eventually adopted throughout all branches of the armed forces. But perhaps the most important lesson she had learned was about the complexity of human relationships within military command structures. Colonel Harrison had laughed at her presentation, but that laugh had been part of a larger test that ultimately proved her worthiness for advancement. His apparent dismissal of her capabilities had actually been evidence of his confidence in her ability to overcome adversity and maintain her professional standards under pressure. In the end, Sarah realized that the colonel had laughed at her not because he thought she was incompetent, but because he believed she was strong enough to handle his skepticism and prove him wrong. It had been a test of her resilience, her character, and her potential for leadership. And, by passing that test, she had earned not only her promotion but also a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor in the United States military.